And welcome into this Zoom video on Facebook Live. This Facebook Live interview on Zoom is presented by Live Casino Hotel, now open and taking all necessary safety precautions. Welcome in. I'm Stan the Fan Charles of PressBox and PressBoxOnline.com. With me is Gary Stein, and I'm thrilled to welcome on here one of my favorite people. I've gotten to cover over 35 years of being in the sports media, and that's the former head coach of Baltimore Ravens, Brian Billick. Brian, it's great to see you.
Good evening, guys. How we doing?
All right, we're doing great. We hope you and your family are all safe and sound. It's good to see you. It really is. Brings back a flood of memories. Yeah. I wanted to start off. I know you won't necessarily be at Ravens camp specifically, and it looks like we may not have a preseason. But can you imagine a Ravens season without Kevin Byrne?
No, absolutely. I just spoke with Kevin the other day. Everything that came out of my mouth, or good or bad, began with Kevin Byrne. I'll put that out there right now. But yeah, I mean, for Kevin, a storied career, obviously, as a PR guy, still keeping in touch with the Ravens to help Chad Steele and the Ravens navigate what is obviously a very unique time. But I just spoke with he and his bride Sally down in Hilton Head, and they're doing great.
Yeah, we had him on. He had a ball with us about 2 weeks after he retired. We had him on for about 40 minutes, and he was great. Hey, I want to get right to it. You and I haven't talked a whole heck of a lot since 2007 when you lost the Ravens head coaching job. Could you have imagined back then, Brian, that you would not coach another football game, at least until this point in time?
Yeah, it was kind of an odd, obviously, when that transition happens, and that's life in the NFL. Certainly my initial thoughts were to get back into coaching. I jumped right into the broadcasting. Fox had hired me to do games.
Yeah.
And over the next 3-4 years, it was interesting, though, when I first took the gig with Fox, Jimmy Johnson pulled me aside. We have, these seminars that you do every year, whether it was Fox, the NFL Network, and Jimmy Johnson, who was obviously doing the pregame show for Fox, pulled me aside. And I didn't know Jimmy that well. And obviously we're talking the way two coaches do. And he says, Brian, it's not my place to say one way or the other, but let me give you some unsolicited advice. Don't go back unless it's just absolutely life or death in your DNA. Yeah. Because otherwise you'll lose. He said, when I went back to Miami, it was a mistake. And I, at the time thinking, okay, well, that's just a guy at a certain point in his career. But as I progressed through and I found out very readily over the next 3 and 4 years, when there were some conversations with some teams, I vowed to myself, I had a pretty good first marriage, so to speak, with Ozzie Newsome. And I wasn't going to get back in just to get back in. I wasn't going to go into a bad situation. And the situations that presented themselves really didn't fit right.
And Brian, let's be honest, not to interrupt you, but most of the jobs that are open are bad jobs most of the time.
Well, I always say the jobs that are open in the NFL are just right. It's like that old commercial years ago about some guy about his wine. He's saying about a bottle of wine. He says it was just right. If it were any better, I wouldn't have given it away. If it were any worse, I wouldn't have drank it. Well, NFL jobs the same way. If they were any better, they wouldn't be available.
Yeah.
If they're any worse, you really wouldn't want to take them. But no, you're right. When a job is offered to you, it's because it's in transition. Although in the NFL, you got to say, you know what? The potential to turn this around pretty quickly is there. But it just didn't seem, there was nothing, the expectations, that what the relationship, I knew I wasn't going to get back to a bad relationship. I wasn't going to go into what I knew was going to be a failed second marriage. And when you follow up with that relationship that Ozzie Newsome and I had in the Ravens and the ownership situation, which was so solid, that's a pretty high bar.
Brian, I covered you all those years back in the Ravens radio days, the early Ravens days when you got here in '99, all the way to the end. What you may not know is that I really listened to what you were saying. Okay, and what I mean by that is what I mean by that is I've got this book.
Very good. How about
which you wrote, Competitive Leadership. Not only did I buy the book, I read the book. Okay, that's number one. not only did I read the book, I took notes from the book.
Wow. You need to send me
And
those notes.
I really appreciate what you wrote in this book. I want to actually paraphrase a couple of sentences here in the foreword, actually, that Andrea Kramer wrote. And you were an early adopter to computerizing and taking away the X's and O's necessarily on a chalkboard and replacing them with game plan emails. And Andrea writes in her foreword that you envisioned a time in the future when players, linebackers, quarterbacks, etc., would have virtual reality opportunities to understand the game and the defense. And today I reread the book as we're preparing for the interview a little bit, and I'm almost astonished at all of these things now that have come true over the last few years. Just talk about that for a little bit.
Well, it was interesting as I was working up through profession, and that was right at the time when obviously computers and PCs and the whole like were just kind of coming into vogue. It's hard for people to imagine now. Yes, we're that old, when we remember where there wasn't the internet, there wasn't Twitter, there wasn't smartphones. And I don't want to pretend like I'm Al Gore and invented the internet here, but I think I was the first one to ever use PowerPoint to present a game plan. A friend of mine that was in a car leasing business introduced me to PowerPoint presentations. I thought, wow, this is incredible. Now we're talking about 1996, 97.
You're with the Vikings. You're with the Vikings at this time.
Yeah. And right now that sounds like, well, yeah, coach, that's no big deal. Well, let's go back to 1997. This was revolutionary. And at the end of the day, as you guys know, I've preached for many years, coaching is nothing more than teaching. And that teaching sequence is at a premium. There's tactics and strategies and dealing with the players. And I get that, all that. But at the end of the day, you are a teacher. And so that teaching sequence, if there was something that I was known for, that I, as I came in and tried to share with my coaches and was maybe a little different than, and it came from Denny Green and Bill Walsh and that whole lineage, but it was the teaching sequence, which was the presentation of the game plan in PowerPoint. It was laying out practices in an organized, extensive way to minimize the fatigue on the players. That was really, for all the things that you can be known of in a profession, that was probably, and of course at the time, some of the pundits were at Camp Cream Puff and all that kind of stuff that people wanted to label it. But when you look at what we were doing when I first came to the Ravens, and previously when I had been with the Vikings, and certainly even with Bill Walsh, when you look now, pre-COVID now, because obviously that's changed everything. You look at the practice schedule, the way that the collective bargaining agreement works, you look at the way training camp works, it's what we were doing back in 2000 in terms of staging practices and separating the hitting periods and limiting the amount of fatigue for the player. I mean, it's like they had, and I can't take credit for that. That goes back to Bill Walsh back in the late 80s, early 90s. But it's like the league finally came around and said, okay, we're going to adopt this league-wide, and this is the way we're going to conduct ourselves.
So, Brian, you mentioned Bill Walsh, and obviously you worked under Bill Walsh. You've co-authored a couple of books under Bill Walsh, but I want to talk about those 2 years where you were with the 49ers. They were very interesting years to me, and I'm sure to you as well. You are acknowledged as part of the Bill Walsh coaching tree, but you actually didn't coach under Bill Walsh.
No.
You were in the administration, you were in public relations, et cetera. Explain those 2 years to us and what eventually, the relationship you developed with Coach Walsh.
Yeah, it was interesting that I was a GA at Brigham Young University, where I went to college. I'd played, I was drafted by the 49ers and cut, signed by the Cowboys, cut. So I'd gone back to BYU like you typically do. I was GAing, doing all the things that GAs do, looking, to get into the profession. I knew I wanted to coach. Well, at the time when Bill Walsh, now let's remember, this was pre-genius Bill Walsh, okay?
Right.
Obviously a great coach, Cincinnati, head coach at Stanford. He just gets the San Francisco 49er job. Well, the PR director for Bill Walsh in San Francisco is a guy named George Hedleston, who I had known in Dallas when I was playing. And Bill, I take great pride in knowing I was the first player programs guy. Bill told George, look, you're going to hire an assistant, but I want him also to be conduit to the players. I want them to do X, Y, and Z. When you look at the job description, it's exactly what the player programs guy does now. So I actually reached out to George Huddleston. I had a friend of mine that wanted to kind of get into PR. And I said, well, what does a guy like that do? He goes, forget your friend. Do you want the job? I said, no, I want to get into coaching. He says, no, just come out and visit with Bill. And so I fly out to San Francisco. I sit with Bill Walsh. Again, this is the pre-Genius label, but you knew right away. And Bill laid out the vision for what he had in mind for the position. And I thought, God, I get into the NFL. How can I pass that up? And when you realize, when you look back, that move, which was, you're right, Stan, was not a coaching position. On that staff was Bruce Coslett, Tony Dungy, John Ralston, John McVay, George Seifert. I mean, the list goes on and on, to Denny Green, which obviously I developed the relationship with on and went on. You know, it's like anything. It's all about relationship. To be there in that capacity and be exposed to that level of capability in the coaching profession, and to be around that was an unbelievable 2-year sabbatical, if you will, to prepare me for then what I eventually went into coaching.
Yeah. Let's jump ahead to the year that the Ravens offer you the job. You're negotiating with them. And in reading today to catch up on your career, I remember I read today that it looked like the Browns had decided they want to hire you too. I don't know if that offer ever was forthcoming, but what sold you on the Ravens versus the Browns?
It was interesting at the time, and obviously coming off the highest scoring offense in the history of the NFL, I was a hot commodity. There were 4 teams that had approached me. It was Kansas City, San Diego, Baltimore, and Cleveland. And San Diego and Kansas City kind of got out of the bidding early. And I'll be honest with you, I was kind of oblivious. It never occurred to me, which is silly, to think about Cleveland and Baltimore and that rivalry and everything it entailed. And fortunately, my agent realized that. But it came down to those 2 teams. And Cleveland offered me the job, regardless of what they say. Carmen Policy and Dwight Clark, who I was with the 49ers when we drafted Dwight Clark. I picked Dwight Clark up at the airport when he was a rookie. And it came down to a back and forth. And it got to a point where neither one wanted to lose. And so I remember we had just lost the Atlanta Falcons. This bidding's going on. My agent was in town. I take my girls home. I come back. It was like midnight. Come back to the hotel in Minneapolis. We're sitting and having these conversations. And during the negotiations, I didn't want to, the very first thing was hold up the team I ended up going to.
Yeah.
So my agent did a brilliant thing with all 4 teams. He said, okay, here's the benchmark. Here's the contract we're looking for. It's a closed bid. You can raise it, you can lower it, whatever you want to do. Okay? Put your bid in. Well, San Diego and Kansas City fell out. Baltimore came back, and David Modell said, we agree to it across the board. And it was a record-setting deal at the time. It was 6 years. It was like $9 million, which was my head coach, Denny Green, who had an incredible career, was making like $500,000 a year. All right. They offered me a 6-year, $9 million contract. Okay. Cleveland. Baltimore comes back and says, okay, we agree, whatever. We agree to the contract. Cleveland comes back. And I don't hear from Cleveland. Well, about 2:00 in the morning, Dwight Clark shows up in a private plane and says, we'll beat whatever number Baltimore does. You got to get on this plane with me, Brian. Well, I had promised Art Modell that I would come and because I already interviewed with Cleveland. That I would come and visit with him face to face. And I said, I've got to honor that. At the end of the day, though, beyond all that, it came down to Ozzie Newsome. Because Denny Green told me, and I didn't know Ozzie. Denny Green told me, Brian, you will work very well with Ozzie Newsome. You and Ozzie will develop. Because remember now, in Baltimore, there was a lot of things up in the air. Ownership of the team and the finance. There was a lot of reasons. A lot of people told me, Brian, don't take the Baltimore job. Go to Cleveland. unlimited budget. You get to start it anew. But I think that combination and the fact that Ozzie was there and what Denny had mentored me was the difference in me choosing Baltimore.
Did you know when you were taking the job in Baltimore, did you understand how great that defense could be, or you took it for some of these other reasons and you just ended up inheriting an amazing defense that was ready to hatch into something?
If you'll remember, in Minnesota, we played Baltimore that year.
Yeah, I remember that.
And so I had a huge respect because I had played that, and we were pretty darn good now. I mean, we were the highest scoring offense in the history of the NFL.
You had a guy named Randy Moss,
Randy Moss and Chris Carter and Jake Reed and Randall Cunningham at quarterback and Robert Smith at running back and two future Hall of Famers in the line of script. We were pretty damn good. And Baltimore, specifically Marvin Lewis, did as good a job against us with limited circumstances as anybody we played. So I had a great deal of respect for it. When I go then, so I take the job, I go down to the Senior Bowl, and I'm going to put my staff together. And I'm going to interview Marvin, okay? Because I've never known Marvin, but just seeing the job that he did, and I saw the assets they had. To say that I knew they were going to be the greatest single season defense in the history of the NFL, no. But I knew these guys are pretty good. So I wanted to interview Marvin. Well, I'm down at the Senior Bowl in Mobile, and Marvin comes in and has the worst interview in the history of the interviews. He was, depressed, upset. He didn't want to leave, this, that, and the other. There was going to be a change. And so when he's done with the interview, I not only don't want to hire him as my quarterback, I don't want to ever be in a room with him again, because this was just a bad. But then once that thing settled in, and I thought, you know what, I need to talk to this guy again, because there are a lot of circumstances. Came back in, and I will say, there was no, in fact, I'll say it's the other way. I'm not sure that Ozzie and Art really wanted me to keep Marvin.
Okay.
There was a lot of, some people say, well, it was pressure, and Ozzie said this was part. No, they were very much, well, you can keep him as a position coach, but really don't think you ought to keep him as a coordinator. But once we came back and connected, and then I staffed him with now, and I give Marvin a great deal of credit now. He had to deal with Jack Del Rio, Rex Ryan, Mike Smith. Yeah. He had some guys that strong personality that went on to become very good coaches. He had a group that he had to deal with, and he did it magnificently. So it was probably one of the best hires I made when I came into Baltimore.
Hey, Brian, one of the things that came out during the playoff run back then in the 2001 season off the field was that you had scripted every single practice from day one of summer camp until the Super Bowl. Not the end of the regular season, not after the first playoff game, but to the Super Bowl. And that's how exacting and precise your preparation and your plans were. The reason I bring that up is because I'd like for you for a minute to transport yourself to being a head coach today during the coronavirus, the pandemic, knowing the precise nature of how you prepare for an NFL season. How would you go about preparing for this NFL season?
Great question.
I've had a couple of conversations with head coaches that have asked that same question. The difficulty is you're going to have 4 and 5 different scenarios.
Yeah.
That we're going to start here. We're going to have 4 preseason games, and regular season starts to maybe 2 preseason games. Time starting camp. I've got all that you alluded to in terms of my practice schedules and scripts and meeting schedule and whatever. And now I open camp, and the league comes out and says, oh, by the way, there'll be no preseason games. So now I got to throw all that out the window, because I have to come up with a 6-week teaching regimen that includes no games, no scrimmages against other teams, and get my team ready, not the least of which is, and evaluate all the young talent we have. It's been daunting for these coaches to deal with it as you go. Forget even just the logistics of the fact that my guys got a report and they test and they go back to the hotel for 3 days and then they test again, and I may lose this player or that player or this room or that room during the course of it. And come up with a teaching progression over a 6-week period of time that's going to feel like the Bataan Death March. For those players and coaches, like, my God, can we just get to the regular season? I honestly, I can't imagine. I can't imagine how the coaches, I think what we'll likely see, keep in mind when you come to training camp, there are 3 conditionings you have to account for. There's cardiovascular, muscular, and then hitting. You got to get in cardiovascular shape. And most of the players will get there pretty quickly if they're not already there. You got in muscular shape. That's the first week or so of the major muscle groups of cutting and, hitting and this and that. It's the hamstring and the calves and the quads and the groin muscles that get through that intense, specific to football movement. But then there's hitting shape. And you legitimately have to have a plan for what is my plan to get the players into hitting shape. And when you have preseason and then some scrimmage and then you have preseason game, you can put that together. Well, now the coaches, the challenge is, how do I get my players into hitting shape without beating them up, exposing them to additional injury? Because now I don't even have that other team to share the snaps with. I got to do it against myself. It's going to be a challenge.
Stanley, you good?
I'm good. I thought you were going next, but let me move back to, and are you okay for like 10 more minutes, Brian?
I'm good.
You're
Sure.
good. I want to go into the Super Bowl season. You and I have had some talks over the years about your decision at the end of it to not bring Trent back and go in the direction of Elvis Grbac. But I wanted to talk about, because we at Press Box, we were talking about an issue we're planning to do in a couple months to celebrate the anniversary of the Super Bowl. And we were talking about how it had never been really done that a quarterback like Trent came out of a benching of your quarterback to take a team to the Super Bowl. Could you talk a little bit about that, about what clicked and what worked?
Well, again, it's just the alignment of, remember, Trent had been basically benched in Tampa Bay.
Yep.
Tony Banks had become our starter.
Mm-hmm.
We realized there was some ambiguity about that going forward, but Tony had some skills. Weren't a lot of other options. We needed a backup. Trent had the experience. I knew he was one that could come in, conceptualize the game plan in meetings, and if then had to be put on the field, could do that. And was very receptive to that. I've got to say this, because yes, it was tough that Trent didn't come back. And I always, I hear one of two things. It's either, I can't believe Brian Billick won a Super Bowl with Trent Dilfer, or I can't believe Trent Dilfer won a Super Bowl with Brian Billick as head coach. Trent ended up being the perfect quarterback for us as we transitioned and recognized, as I finally realized, okay, this defense is not only special, it's all-time special. If we don't turn the ball over, run the ball well, we can win a championship. And that took a while for me during the course of the season. I'm an offensive background. You got to be so good offensively to win it. But I finally realized, no, this group is that special. And when Trent took over, he did a magnificent job of putting his ego on the back burner and recognizing, this is what I've got to do. If we can get a 10-point lead, the game's over. And we don't need to put up a bunch of yards, a whole bunch of points. I don't need it, And for Trent, personally, yeah, that would have been advantageous to him because he needed the next contract.
Right.
So he's the perfect quarterback for us in that Super Bowl year. But when we got to the end of the year, we recognized where Trent's skills were. And not to be negative, but as he went on with his career, it showed that, those skills weren't there. And we had to make the decision, coming back, and we decided to keep that group together. We were going to make one more run. But just decided, it's a lot to ask of our defense to be the highest scoring defense of all time again. We're going to run the ball well. We need more productivity at quarterback. And that led us to the decision that we made. It was an organizational decision. It was a tough decision because you had won a Super Bowl with Trent Dilfer. But it was just one of those things and people forget now, with all due respect, now, we did go to the playoffs and got to the divisional round with Elvis. Now, I know he wasn't the end-all, be-all, and we lost Jamal Lewis in training camp.
That's what I was going to ask you next, is how important.
I don't know that we would have achieved that with Trent Dilfer, with all due respect,
right,
given where his abilities were at the time.
That's where I was going next, was Jamal Lewis and how important he was to that team.
Huge, because in the Super Bowl year, people say, well, you need to run the ball. Well, in order to run the ball in the NFL, you got to be really good defense. Not just good, you got to be great to control a game and think you're going to win the game playing defense and running the ball, because that's just not the way the game is structured now. And Jamal gave us that element. Remember, we had Priest Holmes too.
Yeah.
That's pretty good backup running back at the time. Yeah, and people forget we were, we were the number one defense of all time. We were second in the league in rushing, and we led the league in turnovers, lack of turnovers, I should say. So that's a pretty good combination. And so Jamal was a huge part of that. And to know that going in, and we were going to base that was, because we had some cap issues that we had to extend ourselves. Every time we extended one of those veterans into 2001, Ozzie would come in and go, now, 2002 is going to look like hell. Okay, just so we're all agreed here, because we're going to have no money. Okay, we're all right. We're all don't come back to me next year and going, oh my God, what do we do? So when we made those decisions, it was based on the fact that, I think Jamal's going to have that kind of year, which he eventually did the next year.
Yeah. But
when we lost him in training camp, it was a huge, huge blow.
Brian, you mentioned the special defense that carried the Ravens in 2000. I want to fast forward to a special player that's playing in Baltimore now, and really the position in general. I want to get your take on this. It seemed like it was yesterday when the league was dominated by the prototypical quarterback, the drop back quarterback, big guy, big arm, big smarts, the Bradys, the Mannings, the, Brett Favres of the world, etc. And it just seems like overnight, the Deshaun Watsons and the Pat Mahomes and the Lamar Jacksons and the list can, Russell Wilson, the list can go on and on. Kyler Murray now with the Cardinals. Are you surprised at how quickly the quarterback position has morphed in the NFL? And talk a little bit about what you see with Lamar.
Well, it's interesting. I've got a book coming out in September called The Q Factor. And with a gentleman named Jim Dale, we decided 2 years ago, remember the 2018 draft was going to be the greatest since 1983. There were going to be 4, maybe 5 guys drafted. So we said, okay, we're going to chart these guys going into the draft, what we thought, how they came out of the draft, how they did their first year, and how they did their second year. Mostly as a way of a benchmark of, okay, what does this tell us about quarterback play in the National Football League? And it's interesting because certainly Lamar is that outlier. And the great thing about that group, because you're talking about Baker Mayfield, Josh Allen, and Sam Darnold, and then Josh Rosen, and Lamar Jackson, they each represent the style of play that you're looking for at quarterback. Lamar being the outlier, and all but being the 32nd pick of the draft. And so when you go back and you look at those guys, I'll disagree with you a little bit. Yes, the game has changed to a degree, but Lamar is not the prototype. People say, well, let's go get us a Lamar Jackson. Well, hold on. There are not a lot of those cats running around now.
Right.
And the other guys you mentioned, whether it's Deshaun Watson, whether it's Russell Wilson,
Mahomes,
these guys are capable of beating you from the pocket.
True.
Yes, they do some things outside the pocket, but ultimately it's their ability to operate within the pocket that set. The old adage has been, I can't live with an athlete that can throw the ball. I got to have a quarterback that maybe is an athlete. So has the athleticism expanded a little bit? Yes, but Lamar is truly an outlier. And we are still a league, I believe, until you win a championship with someone who's not that guy. And again, Mahomes can do some dynamic things, but he can beat you from the pocket. So we're still that league, I think, to a degree. And no, I'm not one that believes that the college game is now going to flood into the National Football League. Kyler Murray and Cliff Kingsbury, that's all well and good. I want to wait till they win a few games. Okay? Show me you can win first before we're going to say, yes, that whole style of play, the spread, everything that goes with it. Yes, it has influenced the NFL. Yes, we've become more open. But I still believe in, you better have one of those guys that can beat you from the pocket. Because if you think you're just going to bring in one of these athletic guys that run around and extend plays, the league is that good and that adaptive. I'm not sure that pure style is going to make, maybe I'm old school, but I'm still staying with that guy that can beat you from the pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Coach, I wanted to jump in and piggyback, and looking at your resume, you were a tight ends coach at San Diego State, and at Stanford, you were assistant head coach, tight ends coach. Vikings, you were tight ends. So you know something about tight ends. Talk about Greg Roman and his ability to use tight ends and how important those guys are to this offense and maybe how it's underappreciated by some.
Well, I think it's becoming more appreciated because the tight end position is the best mismatch you have on the field. Whether it's a Kittle, whether it's a Travis Kelce, the great group that the Ravens have an embarrassment of riches at tight end, even to the point where they can trade away a number one draft choice in Hurst. Because at the tight end position, these hybrid guys that now can be inline and you can break them out like a wide receiver. If I have a 2 tight end offense, that's becoming more and more vogue. What defensive personnel do I put on the field? Base, because you can run? Do I put a nickel because these guys can break out into what looks like a forward wide receiver alignment? It really does stretch a team. And who do I put on that tight end? Can't put a linebacker. I can put a safety, but he better be a pretty good cover guy because dropping the box physical safety is not going to do it. I can put a corner on him, but now I got a corner playing in line that has to stop in the run. So the 2 tight end offense, tight ends as a premium, have become more, and we've seen that because it used to be you don't draft safeties, you don't draft tight ends in the first round. But as that ability and the way that they've been used has increased, and now you have these great tight ends. Well, I better use a first round pick on a safety that I can put on these great tight ends. So the game has, it is a great combination, personnel combination that you can challenge a defense with that really puts coordinators into bind as to beyond what I call, who do I have on the field when you've got 2 tight ends on the field?
Excellent answer. Brian, I want to ask you a little bit of a personal question. It involves relationships with people. You essentially fired Trent Dilfer or elected not to bring him back. And Steve Bisciotti, who you were very close with at one time, elected to not bring you back. What is your relationship like with both of those men today? And what have you learned through being on both sides of that kind of dynamic?
Sure, because keeping in mind, I've had to fire people as well. Yep. So I know how that works. It's the NFL. And the NFL, as we know, stands for not for long. There's just an evolution. Trent, and I give Trent credit for this, because it was a very difficult time. And it was very bitter feelings on Trent's part.
Yeah.
Trent came back around and reached out to me to say, Coach, I get it. I understand. I'm cool. I give him great credit for doing that. Steve and I have been great. Steve and I have interacted on a regular basis. I understand totally. Not that I necessarily agree with the decision he made, but I understand it because I've been in that position before. And Steve and I have been great and very honored and very humbled when Steve reached out to me and called and said, hey, it's time for you to go into the Ring of Honor. And that's not something they had to do. And I really appreciated that. And it's a great relationship because I've recognized, look, this is life in the NFL. There's no profit in hanging on to those negative feelings or whatever that you might have. Obviously, when you get fired in the NFL, it's a gut-wrenching experience. It's not just you, it's your entire staff. But that's, particularly in that I've spent the last, first 6 years out of it, I was with Fox.
Yeah.
Which means I sat in the facilities every Friday, virtually every facility in the National Football League. And so with the blinders off, so to speak, and be able to interact with coaches and owners and general managers and players and coaches and look at how the league is operating without the blinders of my team, my situation. And it was, I've always said, had I decided to go back to coaching, I was a better coach. For that experience alone, being around and seeing both good and bad, what makes a good coach, what maybe isn't a good organization versus a bad organization. and recognizing that there is a business end to it. And so my relationship with the Ravens, obviously a lot to do with Kevin Byrne, was very strong. I really appreciated they asked me to come back and do the preseason games. And then when they put in the Ring of Honor, it was one of those deals where great deal of affection for the organization, the people involved, understand the business aspect of it, and at the point in my life where I get it and I'm okay with it.
Gary, you got something else? I got one more after you ask one or two.
Yeah, I've got one more if I can sneak it in there, Brian. It's not as personal as that one, but it kind of piggybacks on that. Anybody who's covered you over time or has had the pleasure of just talking with you at an event, a party, charitable, whatever, knows that there's a lot more to Brian Billick than just coaching football. You're well-read. You could discuss anything: politics, literature, art, boating. You name it. I think you can talk about it.
He's a true Renaissance man.
Yeah,
he's a true Renaissance man.
Absolutely. I guess my question is, are you satisfied with your coaching career at the end of the day?
Interesting. Yeah, interesting question. At the end of the day, when I look back on, I'm 66 years old, and I have that perspective, like you said, the last 12 years, looking at the league from that bigger perspective.
Right.
And I look at my career. I loved what I did. I loved the coaching. We had levels of success that were unparalleled.
Right.
I'm very much appreciative of the opportunity in Baltimore. I'm very comfortable, and I realize it takes a lot of people and a lot of things to come into place. I'm very comfortable with what I know I contributed to that dynamic, whether it was Ozzie Newsome or ownership or the coaches I had, the great players we had. I'm very comfortable with that. I've never wanted to be. I always remember John Madden when he left after 10 years. And Bill Walsh was a big believer. You can't be in one place more than 10 years. This doesn't work. Ownership, the players get tired of the message, the media gets tired of whatever. And Bill was very much, Bill Parcells, as you know, has a programmable, I can only do what I do so long here, and I got to move on. And didn't appreciate it at the time, but I now do recognize that, and that there is an evolution to this. I'm very comfortable with that. And the fact that when I'm asked all the time, why didn't you go back into coaching? Well, I remember John Madden one time saying, once he left coaching, he said, what am I going to do? Win another Super Bowl? Well, yeah, but and I admire those guys, whether it's a Bill Belichick or the guys that take it into the late 60s and continue to grind away. I admire that. But for me, it was like I got to a point where it's, kind of been there, done that. I remember at the draft time, as you know, I do a radio syndication. I have about 20 stations that I do radio shows during the season. And then around the draft, we kick it back up and I do the same thing. And as you guys noted, they're in the Chesapeake. I've got a partner at a small boat brokerage business. I'd be doing the Bay Bridge boat show, always around the draft and sitting on boats, in these 40 and 50 foot boats, which I love. I do my radio shows and say, well, do you miss it? Do you want to go back into coaching? I go, okay, let me get this straight. I'm sitting on the back of the boat. It's a beautiful day. Got a nice drink here. You want me to go back into a windowless room, looking at the same tackle that I looked at last year is going to be the same SOB I'm going to look at next year, doing the same thing. I'm kind of okay with what I'm doing. So I had great admiration for those guys that continue to plow through it. I've never wanted to be one of those guys that did what I did simply because I couldn't do anything else. And so I'm very, very comfortable and enjoy what I'm doing right now. Particularly, I still work for the NFL Network, kind of keep close enough to it, keep my finger on it, but don't have to deal with that 24/7 grind that is being a coach in the NFL.
I was talking to, do you remember Rick Schaefer, former agent in the NFL?
Sure.
Rick does a podcast. He sort of produces it with Bill Polian, and they just interviewed Tony Dungy, and they said to Tony Dungy, Tony, you're 64 years old. Two great coaches, Joe Gibbs and Dick Vermeil, both came back at the age of 64. How about it? And Tony said, ain't happening with me. So I was going to say, you're just lucky you're 66.
Well,
Hey.
yeah, and Tony, as we know, and there's no classier guy in the
Yeah.
NFL ever than Tony Dungy. Tony has the great bigger picture. He has other priorities in his life right
Yeah.
now, his ministry and the things that he's doing. Loved his time coaching. Great coach. Tony and I coached together in Minnesota.
Yep.
I acknowledge Tony as being a big factor in my learning how to be an offensive coordinator and game plan. Watching how to, Tony game planned against offensive coordinators when we were the Vikings together, and thought, okay, well, if you're doing it this way, then I need to counter that. So Tony, just a wonderful mentor for me, and obviously a tremendous head coach. But there again has the value system, and that's not to say that those that are still coaching don't have the proper value. They love it. They're involved, immersed in it. That's great. But Tony is very much one that has, at a point in his life where, you know what, there's other things I need to be doing right now.
I've got to say goodbye in just a minute, but I got one question for you, Coach. And it involves a father and a son. Art Modell, and how miffed I get, and especially this past year where they added some more people that could get in on this one-time shot. Art Modell, Hall of Fame, and David Modell, how important he was to the Ravens when they first started, if you could talk about both of them.
Huge. The vision for it, Art, and his passion for the game, the way he treated people, his ability to hire good people. And Art, what you're talking about, I'll selfishly say myself, but including a Ozzie Newsome and a Kevin Byrne, and just across the board, Bill Tessendorf, he knew how to hire good people.
Yep.
And for Art, for a lot of different reasons, and we understand the change from Cleveland to Baltimore,
Yep,
and the acrimony and all that. For Art, for me, and I'll admit my bias up front, for Art not to be in the Hall of Fame, to a degree, lessens and delegitimizes the Hall of Fame. When you don't have someone that had the career that Art had, was basically one that ushered in Monday Night Football, was head of that broadcast committee, to not have him in the Hall of Fame, I think is a travesty, and I think it diminishes the Hall.
And David Modell, his importance to the organization in those formative years.
David had a passion for the game, a passion for the organization, an energy that I agree with you 100%, Stan, was not fully appreciated.
Yeah.
And the little things he did in the back. I'll give you a quick little story. In the Super Bowl, we go down and we're sequestered in that hotel in Tampa Bay. And I never left the hotel. Is
this the billboard story?
No. This is one where,
different story. All right.
So, but that's an excellent example where David they had billboards come back from practice. We'd see these billboards, little things like that.
Yeah.
So because I'm in the hotel every day, and obviously you're getting ready, and so I'm going down to the administrative level, which was the second floor, every day, and walking through and checking with Bill, with Kevin Byrne and Patty Holtree and Bob Eller and all the operations. How we doing? Everything going okay? Great, no problem. God, we got this thing nailed. We're kicking this thing. Come to find out, David Modell, the day we got into Tampa, got the entire administrative staff together and said, now look, we know Coach. When he comes down, I don't care if there are bodies in the closet. I don't care if we have lost half the team. When he asks you if everything's okay, good, Coach, no problem. We're good to go. It was little things like that you appreciated, that David was trying to create an atmosphere that allowed everybody to do their job. And we miss him.
I miss David quite a bit. I miss the old man too, but David, I really miss. Brian, I'm going to ask you in a couple of months, we're going to be doing that cover story and press box on the
we'll do it.
Road to the Super Bowl, and we'll get in touch with you. Really appreciate
it. Will be great fun.
Your time. I hope your family stays safe. Gary, as always,
great. You too.
Thank you.
Brian,
I want to remind folks,
guys,
don't miss any of our great interviews and information. Be sure to like the press box page and share this interview. For Gary Stein, I'm Stan the Fan, and we thank you again, Coach Billick.
Sounds good, guys.